Hello, everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
A small plastic card. Have you ever looked at something so ordinary that everyone else ignored it, yet it quietly changed your entire life? What if I told you that after living in the United States for 10 years, the happiest moment of my journey was not buying my first car, not getting married, not buying a house, and not receiving a promotion? It was receiving a simple plastic library card. If you have ever felt embarrassed to speak English, afraid of making mistakes, or wondered whether you truly belong somewhere, then stay with me until the end of this story. I think you may discover that the smallest milestones often become the biggest victories. My name is Daniel, and this story happened in the United States, where I have lived for more than 10 years. When people hear that number, they usually smile and say, "Oh, your English must be perfect now." I always laugh politely because the truth is much more complicated. Living in America does not magically make someone fluent in English. Every day gives you opportunities, but it also gives you excuses to stay silent. For years, I became an expert at avoiding conversations. I smiled instead of speaking. I nodded even when I understood only half of what people said. At grocery stores, I chose self-checkout machines because they never judged my pronunciation. At restaurants, I ordered the same meal again and again because I already knew how to say its name. My comfort zone became very small, and I decorated it so well that I almost forgot I was trapped inside it. Maybe you know that feeling. Your brain tells you that one mistake will make everyone laugh. Your heart beats faster every time someone asks a simple question. Ironically, psychologists explain that our brains naturally overestimate social embarrassment. Most people are busy thinking about themselves, not about our tiny grammar mistakes. Yet our minds often create imaginary audiences that never actually exist. I wish someone had told me that 10 years earlier. When I first arrived in America, everything felt enormous. The highways were wider. The supermarkets were larger than any place I had visited before. Even the sky seemed bigger somehow. Summer was hotter than I expected. Winter surprised me with icy mornings that made every breath look like white smoke. Every season felt like another lesson about adapting, just as every English conversation became another lesson about patience. Life slowly became busy. I found work. I met wonderful people. Later, I met the woman who would completely change my life. We built a home together. We got married. We eventually had children whose English sounded effortless while I still paused to think about simple sentences. Watching my children speak confidently with teachers, neighbors, and friends made me proud. But it also reminded me how much confidence I still needed to build. People often think confidence comes first and action follows. My experience taught me the opposite. Action comes first. Confidence quietly catches up later. Still, there was one place I avoided for an entire decade. The public library. That may sound ridiculous. A library is probably one of the quietest, friendliest places in America. Nobody there asks difficult questions. Nobody expects perfect English. Nobody gives grades. Yet every time I walked past those beautiful glass doors, I invented another excuse. I'm too busy. I'll go next month. My English isn't good enough. They'll probably ask questions I can't answer. Those excuses became part of my routine. Looking back now, I realize the library wasn't the place I feared. I feared becoming the beginner again. Scientists who study learning often explain that our brains dislike uncertainty, because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. But discomfort is also where learning happens. Every new skill begins with awkward moments. Children understand this naturally. Adults spend years trying to avoid it. One Saturday morning, everything changed because of something completely unexpected. My daughter came home from school carrying 3 colorful books and asked me a simple question. "Dad, why don't you have a library card?" The room became strangely quiet. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. How could I explain that I had lived in America for 10 years, but had never found enough courage to ask for a free library card. How could I explain that it wasn't really about the card? It was about fear. Fear wearing ordinary clothes. Fear hiding behind polite smiles. Fear whispering, "Maybe tomorrow." That night I couldn't stop thinking about her question. Sometimes life doesn't change because of a dramatic event. Sometimes it changes because an innocent child asks one honest sentence. I had no idea that a small piece of plastic was about to become one of the most emotional symbols of my entire American journey, or that walking into a quiet library would teach me more about belonging, family, love, and learning English than I had imagined possible. The next morning I decided I would finally walk through those doors. I had no idea that one ordinary visit was about to become a ceremony I would remember forever. My first American days. The funny thing about moving to America is that nobody warns you about the quiet moments. People tell you about skyscrapers, opportunity, bigger houses, and the American dream. They show you pictures of New York, California beaches, and colorful autumn leaves in New England. But almost nobody tells you what it feels like to stand inside a supermarket, staring at 50 different kinds of bread, while realizing you cannot understand half the labels. Nobody tells you that a simple question like, paper or plastic, can make your heart race during your first week. Looking back today, I smile about those moments, but at the time they felt enormous. When my airplane landed in the United States, I believed my English was good enough. I had studied grammar for years. I knew hundreds of vocabulary words. I could pass written exams without much trouble. Then the immigration officer welcomed me with a friendly smile, and spoke so naturally that my brain froze for several seconds. I caught only a few familiar words. I answered carefully, hoping my pronunciation sounded understandable. He stamped my passport, wished me good luck, and that short conversation somehow felt more difficult than every English test I had ever taken. Outside the airport, everything looked bigger than I had imagined. The roads seemed endless. Pickup trucks looked like giant machines. The sky felt wider. Even the coffee cups were much larger than the ones I was used to. America was exciting, but it also reminded me every hour that I was a beginner again. The weather surprised me almost immediately. My first summer was hotter than I expected, with bright sunshine that seemed to last forever. A few months later, winter arrived with freezing winds that turned every morning into a small adventure. The first time I scraped ice from a car windshield, I laughed because I had only seen people do that in movies. Every season introduced a new habit, a new challenge, and a new English word I needed to learn. Culture surprised me even more than the weather. Neighbors smiled at strangers. Cashiers asked, "How's your day going?" People thanked bus drivers before getting off. At first, I thought everyone wanted to start long conversations. Soon I realized these small exchanges were simply part of everyday American life. They were tiny moments of kindness that connected complete strangers for just a few seconds. Ironically, those simple conversations frightened me the most. Whenever someone spoke unexpectedly, my brain rushed through thousands of possible answers. By the time I finally chose one, the conversation had already ended. Researchers who study language learning often explain that stress temporarily reduces our ability to recall vocabulary. In other words, the more nervous you become, the harder your brain works against you. That perfectly described my daily life. So I developed little survival tricks. I memorized the same greetings. I practiced ordering coffee in my head before entering the cafe. I watched other customers first, hoping to copy their sentences. If someone asked an unexpected question, I smiled and quietly hoped they would repeat it. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. Every evening, I replayed those conversations inside my mind. I always found the perfect answer 5 hours too late. Life, however, refused to wait until my English became perfect. I found a steady job. My coworkers came from many different backgrounds. Some spoke Spanish at home. Others had grown up in Korea, India, Mexico, or Vietnam. That surprised me. I had imagined everyone in America would speak flawless English from birth. Instead, I discovered millions of people were learning, improving, and adapting every single day. Somehow that realization made me breathe a little easier. One older coworker gave me advice that I still remember. He smiled and said, "Your accent tells people you've had the courage to live more than one life." That sentence stayed with me for years. Instead of seeing my accent as proof that I didn't belong, I slowly began seeing it as evidence of my journey. Still, confidence did not arrive overnight. Some mornings I felt brave. Other mornings I stayed completely silent. Progress rarely moves in a straight line. It moves like the weather. Some days are sunny. Some days are cloudy. But the seasons always change. Little by little, America stopped feeling unfamiliar. I learned where to buy groceries. I recognized local holidays. I looked forward to Thanksgiving dinners, neighborhood barbecues, Christmas lights, and warm conversations with friendly neighbors. The country that once felt impossibly large slowly became a place that felt more like home. Then something happened that changed my life in an entirely unexpected way. I met a woman whose smile somehow made every English sentence easier to say. I didn't know it then, but our first awkward conversation would eventually lead to marriage, children, countless family memories, and the courage to face fears I had been carrying since the day I arrived in America. Looking back now, I realize my American story was never really about learning English. It was about learning to believe that I belonged. And that lesson was only beginning. Love changed everything. People often say love speaks its own language. I used to think that was just something people wrote inside greeting cards or romantic movies. Then one rainy Saturday afternoon in America, I discovered that love sometimes begins with an awkward sentence, a nervous smile, and a grammar mistake that neither person ever forgets. If someone had told me that my greatest English teacher would eventually become my wife, I probably would have laughed. Yet life has an interesting habit of hiding its biggest surprises inside completely ordinary days. I met her at a neighborhood farmer's market on a cool autumn morning. The trees were glowing with shades of orange, red, and gold, and the air smelled like fresh apples, warm cinnamon, and roasted coffee. I wasn't looking for romance. Honestly, I was simply trying to buy vegetables without embarrassing myself. I had already rehearsed my shopping list several times in my head, because I still worried about pronouncing certain words correctly. Then I reached for the last basket of strawberries at exactly the same moment as someone else. We both stopped. We both smiled. "You first," she said. Instead of saying, "Thank you," I became so nervous that I answered, "You too." She looked confused for 1 second. Then she laughed. Not the kind of laugh that makes you feel foolish. The kind that makes you feel welcome. That tiny moment completely changed my day. We started talking while standing beside the fruit stand. At least she was talking comfortably. I was busy translating every sentence inside my head before answering. Every response felt like solving a puzzle, while someone waited patiently for the final piece. Surprisingly, she never rushed me. She listened carefully. She smiled every time I searched for the right word. Sometimes she even waited through long moments of silence without making them feel uncomfortable. That was new for me. Until then, I believed conversations were competitions. She showed me they could simply be connections. Her name was Emily. She had grown up in a small town in Oregon and loved books, hiking, baking homemade bread, and visiting local libraries almost every weekend. At the time, I didn't realize that last detail would become incredibly important years later. Our first coffee together lasted nearly 2 hours. Not because I spoke fluently. Quite the opposite. I probably spoke less than anyone else in the cafe. But Emily had a rare gift. She asked simple questions. She spoke clearly. She never corrected every mistake. Instead, she celebrated every attempt. Language experts often explain that learners improve fastest when they feel psychologically safe. The brain absorbs information more efficiently when fear is reduced. Looking back now, I think Emily unknowingly created exactly that environment for me. She didn't become my English teacher. She became the reason I wanted to keep speaking. Of course, not everything was easy. Sometimes my mistakes created unforgettable memories. One evening she invited me to dinner with her parents. I wanted to compliment her mother's cooking. Instead of saying, "The chicken is tender," I accidentally said, "The chicken is tired." For 2 seconds the entire table became silent. Then everyone burst into laughter. Even I couldn't stop laughing. Her father smiled and said, "Poor chicken. It must have had a long day." That joke stayed in the family for years. Surprisingly, moments like that stopped frightening me. They reminded me that mistakes rarely destroy relationships. They usually create stories. As our relationship grew stronger, I began noticing small differences between our cultures. In my home country, people often waited before expressing emotions openly. Emily's family hugged each other the moment they walked through the front door. They said, "I love you," without hesitation. They celebrated birthdays with ridiculous hats, homemade cakes, and loud singing that was rarely in tune. At first, everything felt slightly overwhelming. Then, little by little, those traditions became part of my own life. Winter became our favorite season. We decorated the house together before Christmas. We drank hot chocolate after walking through neighborhoods covered in colorful lights. She patiently explained holiday traditions that had once seemed confusing to me. In return, I introduced her to recipes and family customs from my own childhood. Without realizing it, we weren't simply building a relationship. We were building a new culture inside our own home. One evening, while watching snow quietly fall outside our living room window, Emily asked me a question I had secretly been avoiding for years. "Why do you apologize every time you speak English?" I looked at her without answering. She continued gently, "You say sorry before almost every sentence, even when you haven't done anything wrong." I had never noticed. She was right. Somewhere along the way, I had started believing my accent was something I needed to apologize for. Emily reached for my hand. Then she said something I have never forgotten. "I didn't fall in love with perfect English. I fell in love with you." Those words changed something deep inside me. For the first time since arriving in America, I stopped measuring every conversation by the number of grammar mistakes I made. Instead, I began measuring them by the connections I created. Months later, I asked Emily to marry me. She smiled before I even finished the question. That simple yes became the beginning of a new chapter filled with love, laughter, unexpected challenges, and eventually children who would teach me lessons neither of us could have imagined. I believed marriage would be the hardest adventure of my life. I had no idea that becoming a father would completely rewrite everything I thought I knew about love, family, courage, and learning English one conversation at a time. Building our family. People often believe the hardest part of moving to a new country is finding a job or learning a new language. I believed that too until the day I held my first child in my arms. In that single moment, every fear I had ever carried about English suddenly felt much smaller than the responsibility of becoming a father. Nobody hands you a perfect instruction book for raising children, especially when you are still learning the language, the culture, and even the tiny unwritten rules of everyday life in America. Looking back now, I realize our family was built one ordinary conversation at a time, and those conversations quietly became the greatest English lessons I had ever received. When Emily told me she was pregnant, I smiled so hard my face actually hurt. I wanted to say something wise and unforgettable, but instead I simply whispered, "We're really doing this." She laughed, hugged me, and said, "Yes, and we're going to figure it out together." That sentence became the unofficial motto of our marriage. We didn't need perfect plans. We only needed the willingness to keep learning together. Pregnancy introduced us to an entirely new vocabulary. Suddenly our calendar was filled with doctor's appointments, ultrasounds, parenting classes, and conversations about things I had never imagined discussing in English. Words like heartbeat, crib, stroller, and car seat quickly became part of my daily life. Every appointment felt like another listening exercise. Sometimes I understood everything. Sometimes I silently repeated new words inside my head all the way home. Research on language acquisition suggests that vocabulary connected to strong emotions is remembered more easily because emotional experiences activate deeper memory pathways. Looking back, I believe that's exactly why I never forgot those words. They weren't just vocabulary anymore. They became part of our family's story. The day our daughter was born remains one of the happiest and most overwhelming days of my life. Hospitals in America amazed me with their organization, kindness, and calm efficiency. Nurses patiently explained every procedure. Doctors answered every question, and everyone somehow knew exactly what to do while I stood there feeling both incredibly excited and completely unprepared. When the nurse placed our tiny daughter into my arms, she opened her eyes for just a moment. I looked at her and quietly promised that I would become the father she deserved, even if I still stumbled over English sentences. Life changed overnight. Our peaceful evenings disappeared. Sleep became a luxury. Coffee became a close friend. Our house filled with diapers, baby bottles, tiny socks, and toys that somehow appeared in every room. Yet despite the exhaustion, our home had never felt more alive. Every small milestone felt like winning a championship. The first smile. The first laugh. The first step. The first word. Ironically, our daughter also became one of my best English teachers. Children ask endless questions. Dad, why is the sky blue? Why do birds fly? Why do leaves change color? First, I searched for perfect answers. Then I realized simple answers worked much better. That discovery changed the way I learned English forever. Instead of chasing difficult vocabulary, I focused on speaking clearly and naturally. Language experts often emphasize that fluency grows from frequent, meaningful communication rather than memorizing complicated words. Our daily family conversations proved that idea better than any textbook ever could. A few years later, our son joined the family, bringing twice the laughter and twice the chaos. Suddenly our mornings looked like small adventures. Someone couldn't find a shoe. Someone spilled cereal across the kitchen floor. Someone insisted on wearing a superhero cape to school. Emily and I often looked at each other, laughed, and somehow managed to get everyone out the door only a few minutes late. Family dinners became my favorite classroom. Every evening we shared stories about our day. The children talked about school projects. Emily shared funny moments from work. I practiced listening carefully instead of worrying about speaking perfectly. Sometimes I still made grammar mistakes. The children occasionally corrected me without even realizing it. Instead of feeling embarrassed, I thanked them. Our dining table became a place where mistakes were welcomed, because mistakes meant someone was trying. That simple idea slowly transformed my confidence. Weekends became another beautiful tradition. We visited local parks, watched Little League baseball games, explored farmers markets, and attended community festivals. I noticed something interesting about American family life. Parents often encourage children to ask questions, express opinions, and participate in conversations with adults. First, this felt unfamiliar to me. Over time, I began doing the same with our own children. Our home became filled with curiosity instead of perfection. Still, one surprising detail remained unchanged. Almost every Saturday, Emily packed a canvas bag with books and headed to the public library. The children loved going. They raced toward the colorful reading corner. They knew the librarians by name. They proudly carried home stacks of books every single week. And every single week I stayed home. I always invented another excuse. I'll finish some work. You three go ahead. I'll come next time. I still believed I didn't belong there. Even after building a career. Even after getting married. Even after becoming a father. One quiet evening, as I watched my children reading library books together on the living room floor, I suddenly wondered how many beautiful experiences I had missed, because I was still listening to fear instead of possibility. That question stayed with me much longer than I expected. And before long, life would give me an answer I could no longer ignore. 10 years of avoiding the library. It is strange how fear can disguise itself as responsibility. It does not usually shout. It whispers. It tells you that today is not the right day, that next week will be better, that you should become more confident before trying something new. I believed those whispers for 10 years. Looking back now, I was never actually avoiding a building filled with books. I was avoiding a moment that forced me to admit I was still afraid. The most surprising part is that almost nobody around me knew. From the outside, I looked like someone who had successfully built a life in America. Inside, one small unfinished challenge quietly followed me everywhere I went. Every Saturday morning followed almost exactly the same routine. Emily packed a reusable bag. Our children argued about which books they wanted to return first, and the house filled with excited voices. Our daughter loved adventure stories. Our son preferred books about dinosaurs, rockets, and anything with colorful pictures. Emily always borrowed at least one novel and one cookbook. They invited me every single week. "Dad, are you coming? I'll stay home today. You can help us choose books. Maybe next Saturday." That answer became so familiar that I barely noticed I was repeating it. Children have an amazing ability to accept simple explanations. They never questioned my decision. They simply hugged me goodbye, climbed into the car, and waved as they drove away. I stood at the front window smiling until the car disappeared around the corner. Then the house became unusually quiet. For years, I convinced myself I enjoyed those peaceful mornings alone. The truth was completely different. I always wondered what I was missing. Sometimes I imagined the library as an enormous place filled with people reading complicated books. I pictured librarians asking difficult questions that I would struggle to understand. I imagined filling out confusing forms, spelling my name incorrectly, or misunderstanding simple instructions. Looking back, every one of those fears existed only inside my imagination. Psychologists often describe this as anticipatory anxiety. The human brain is surprisingly talented at predicting disasters that almost never happen. In fact, studies have shown that people frequently overestimate both the likelihood and the emotional impact of embarrassing situations. My brain had written an entire movie about failure before I had even opened the library door. One afternoon, while waiting for my family to return, I searched online to learn more about public libraries in America. I expected complicated membership rules and expensive fees. Instead, I discovered something completely different. Public libraries were designed for everyone: children, parents, seniors, college students, new immigrants, people learning English, even visitors who simply wanted a quiet place to read. Many libraries offered free language classes, conversation groups, computer access, family activities, audiobooks, and community events. The more I read, the more embarrassed I became. Everything I needed had been waiting only a few miles from my house. For 10 years. Without asking for anything except that I walk through the front door. Emily never laughed when I shared those thoughts with her. She simply listened. Then she said something that stayed in my mind. "You know, libraries aren't places where people expect you to know everything. They're places people go because they want to learn." That sentence sounded so obvious. Yet somehow I had never looked at it that way. A few days later, our daughter came home from school carrying a colorful reading log. She proudly explained that every book she borrowed from the library helped her reach a new reading goal. She placed several books on the kitchen table and began reading aloud while I prepared dinner. Occasionally she paused to ask the meaning of a word. Ironically, sometimes I knew the answer. Other times we searched together. Those moments became little family adventures. I realized something important. Learning English did not always happen in classrooms. It happened while cooking dinner, reading bedtime stories, laughing at funny mistakes, and asking simple questions without feeling ashamed. Still, despite all these discoveries, I continued postponing my own visit. Fear is stubborn. It does not disappear just because logic tells it to. It waits patiently for another excuse. Then one ordinary evening, something completely unexpected happened. Emily accidentally left her library card on the kitchen counter before going upstairs. I picked it up, turning the small plastic card over in my hands. It looked incredibly ordinary. Her name, a barcode, the library logo. Nothing about it suggested courage, transformation, or life-changing moments. Yet I couldn't stop staring at it. Our son noticed. "Dad," he asked, "where's your library card?" I smiled awkwardly. "I don't have one." His eyes grew wide with genuine surprise. "You've lived here longer than me." I laughed softly. "That's true." He thought for a second before asking the question that completely caught me off guard. "So, what are you waiting for?" Children have a remarkable gift. They ask simple questions that adults spend years avoiding. I had no answer. Not one that made sense. That night, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone in the living room thinking about everything my family had quietly gained from the library over the years. They had discovered stories, knowledge, friendships, confidence, and joyful memories together. The only person missing from those memories was me. For the first time in 10 years, I admitted something I had never said out loud. I wasn't afraid of speaking English anymore. I was afraid of discovering that fear had been controlling my life all along. The next morning, before I could invent another excuse, I picked up my car keys, took a deep breath, and drove toward the local library. I had no idea that the person waiting behind the front desk was about to change the way I saw myself forever. The day I finally walked inside, the parking lot looked completely ordinary, and somehow that made everything feel even more intimidating. Cars came and went without hesitation. Parents held the hands of excited children. A retired couple walked toward the entrance carrying a canvas bag already filled with books. A teenager sat on a bench reading a thick novel as if the rest of the world had disappeared. Nobody looked nervous. Nobody looked like they were preparing for one of the biggest emotional moments of their life. Yet there I was, sitting behind the steering wheel, staring at the library building with my hands resting quietly on the keys. It was almost funny. I had crossed oceans, built a career, married the woman I loved, and raised 2 wonderful children in America. But for nearly 10 minutes I could not convince myself to open a single car door. My mind immediately started producing familiar excuses. "You can come back tomorrow. It's probably busy. You forgot to bring something. You should practice a little more English first." Those thoughts sounded incredibly reasonable. That was exactly why they had controlled me for 10 years. Then I remembered my son's simple question. "So, what are you waiting for?" For the first time I answered honestly. Nothing. I was waiting for fear to disappear before taking action. But every meaningful decision in my life had happened while I was still afraid. I stepped out of the car. The morning air felt cool and fresh. A gentle breeze moved through the trees surrounding the building, and sunlight reflected softly across the large glass windows. The library itself did not look intimidating at all. It looked peaceful, almost welcoming. As I walked closer, I noticed colorful posters advertising children's story hours, free English conversation groups, job search workshops, technology classes for seniors, and family reading events. I stopped for a moment. Free English conversation. How many years had I spent believing I had nowhere to practice? The answer made me smile. Too many. When the automatic doors quietly opened, something unexpected happened. Nobody looked at me. Nobody stopped what they were doing. Nobody cared that I was walking in for the very first time. The building smelled like paper, fresh coffee, and polished wood. Soft conversations floated gently through the air. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. Pages quietly turned. Keyboards clicked softly from a computer area nearby. Instead of feeling like a place where people judged each other, the library felt like a place where everyone was busy becoming a slightly better version of themselves. A woman behind the welcome desk looked up and smiled. "Good morning." Her voice was warm and relaxed. For a second, my old habit returned. I almost smiled silently and walked away. Instead, I took one slow breath. "Good morning," I answered. I would like to get a library card." There it was. One sentence. The sentence I had postponed for an entire decade. The librarian smiled even more brightly. "Of course. We'd be happy to help." That was it. No complicated interview. No difficult vocabulary test. No suspicious expression. Just kindness. She handed me a short application form and pointed toward a nearby table. "Take your time. If you have any questions, just let me know." Take your time. Those 4 words. Researchers studying language anxiety often explain that people learn more effectively when they feel accepted rather than evaluated. The brain shifts from a defensive state into a learning state when it senses psychological safety. Standing there in that quiet library, I understood exactly what they meant. Nobody expected perfection. They simply expected participation. The application itself was surprisingly simple. Name, address, phone number, email. I laughed quietly to myself. I had imagined pages of confusing paperwork. Instead, it took less than 3 minutes. When I returned the form, the librarian checked my identification, typed a few details into her computer, and then reached into a small drawer. She pulled out a brand new plastic card. "This is yours," she said. For a brief moment, I simply stared at it. It was ordinary. White background. Blue library logo. A barcode. My name. Nothing fancy. Yet somehow it felt heavier than any credit card I had ever carried. It represented 10 years of hesitation finally ending. The librarian noticed my smile. "First library card?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes." Then I added something I had never expected to say. "I've lived here for 10 years. Her eyes widened slightly. "Well," she said gently, "welcome. We're glad you're here." Not "why did you wait?" Not "what took so long?" Simply, "we're glad you're here." I felt something tighten in my throat. Sometimes people imagine life-changing moments as loud celebrations. Mine happened in complete silence. No applause. No fireworks. Just one sentence from a stranger who had no idea how much those words meant. She handed me a small brochure explaining library services. "We also have English reading clubs, conversation circles, free digital books, audiobooks, and family events every week." I looked at her in surprise. "Really?" She smiled. "Absolutely. This place belongs to everyone. Everyone. Including me." As I slowly walked through the building, I noticed people from every age and background. Young children sat listening to a volunteer read stories with dramatic voices. High school students studied together before exams. College students typed quietly on laptops. Elderly neighbors discussed books over coffee. A young mother read picture books beside her toddler. An immigrant family spoke softly in 2 different languages while choosing books together. Nobody seemed out of place. Everyone belonged. For the first time since arriving in America, I realized that belonging is rarely something another person gives you. Often, it begins the moment you decide to step through a door you have been afraid to open. I slipped the small plastic card into my wallet. Fit perfectly. Yet somehow it felt as though something much larger had finally found its place. I had come expecting to borrow a book. Instead, I had quietly borrowed a new version of myself. A card that meant more. If someone had looked inside my wallet that afternoon, they would have seen nothing extraordinary. A driver's license. A bank card. A few family photos folded behind a clear plastic sleeve. And now one brand new library card. To anyone else, it was just another piece of plastic. But as I sat quietly in my car before driving home, I found myself holding that little card with both hands as if it were an award I had spent 10 years trying to earn. The funny thing about milestones is that the world rarely notices them. Sometimes the biggest victories happen so quietly that only your own heart applauds. That morning, I hadn't simply become a library member. I had finally become the person I had wanted to be ever since arriving in America. I didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, I looked through the windshield at the library entrance. Families continued walking inside. Children carried colorful books almost as big as their backpacks. An elderly man smiled while balancing a stack of mystery novels. A young college student rode away on a bicycle with books carefully secured inside a backpack. Life continued exactly as it had before. Nothing outside had changed. Everything inside me had. Scientists who study personal growth often describe something called a psychological turning point. Interestingly, these moments are rarely dramatic. They usually happen after one small action finally proves to the brain that an old fear is no longer true. The action itself may last only a few minutes, but the belief it creates can last for years. Sitting there with that simple library card, I realized I had just experienced one of those turning points. For 10 years I had believed I wasn't ready. In less than 15 minutes, reality quietly proved otherwise. On the drive home, I stopped at a red light and caught myself smiling for absolutely no reason. The driver beside me probably thought I had received wonderful news. In a way I had. Not because someone gave me permission to belong. Because I had finally given that permission to myself. When I walked through the front door, Emily was preparing lunch while the children sat at the kitchen table drawing pictures. Our daughter looked up first. "Dad, did you go?" I smiled without saying a word. Instead, I slowly placed the library card on the table. For about 2 seconds nobody spoke. Then both children jumped from their chairs at exactly the same time. "You got one. I knew you could do it." Our son grabbed the card, holding it up like a championship trophy. Emily walked over smiling. She didn't congratulate me with a long speech. She simply wrapped her arms around me and whispered, "I'm proud of you." Those 4 words almost made me cry. Not because earning a library card was difficult, because someone understood what it had truly cost. Courage is funny. From the outside, people only see the action. They rarely see the years of invisible battles that happened before it. That afternoon, we all returned to the library together. This time, everything felt different. Instead of waiting nervously near the entrance, I walked confidently beside my family. The children's section exploded with color, laughter, and imagination. Tiny chairs surrounded bright picture books. A volunteer read stories using silly voices that made every child laugh. Parents sat on the carpet reading together. I suddenly realized this wasn't simply a building filled with books. It was a place where families quietly built memories. Emily showed me shelves she had visited for years. "This is where I found that cookbook. That's where the kids discovered their favorite bedtime stories. And over there is my favorite reading corner." I laughed softly. For a decade, she had been inviting me into this beautiful little world. I had been saying no to all of it. Then something unexpected caught my attention. Near one corner of the library stood a small bookshelf labeled Easy English Books. Beside it was another sign. English Conversation Club. Every Wednesday evening. Everyone welcome. Everyone. There was that word again. I walked toward the shelf and picked up a short novel written for English learners. The sentences were clear. The vocabulary felt comfortable. For the first time in years, reading English didn't feel like homework. It felt relaxing. Research on language learning consistently shows that learners improve faster when reading material is only slightly above their current level. Books that are too difficult often create frustration, while books that are understandable build confidence, vocabulary, and fluency at the same time. Looking around that shelf, I suddenly understood why libraries remain one of America's greatest free learning resources. They don't simply lend books. They quietly remove barriers. Before leaving, I checked out my very first book. The librarian scanned my new card and smiled. "Congratulations on your first checkout." It sounded like such an ordinary sentence. Yet hearing it filled me with ridiculous happiness. Walking back to the car, our daughter reached for my hand. "Dad," she said, "now we can all borrow books together." Such a simple sentence. But I knew she wasn't talking only about books. She was talking about belonging, about sharing experiences, about finally joining a family tradition that had existed without me for years. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, I opened my first library book and read only a few pages. Slowly, carefully, enjoying every sentence. For the first time since arriving in America, I wasn't reading English because I had to. I was reading because I wanted to. And in that quiet moment, I realized something even more valuable than the library card itself. The real milestone had never been made of plastic. It was made of courage, one small decision at a time. New habits, new confidence. Most people think confidence arrives first and then good habits follow. My experience taught me something completely different. Confidence is usually the reward, not the starting point. It grows quietly after you repeat one small action so many times that your brain finally stops treating it as something dangerous. That tiny library card resting inside my wallet did not magically transform my English overnight. It did something far more powerful. Changed my routine. And once my routine changed, my life slowly followed. Looking back now, I can honestly say that my biggest breakthrough in English never happened inside a classroom. It happened during hundreds of ordinary afternoons inside one peaceful American library. The following Saturday, I did something that would have been impossible only a week earlier. When Emily picked up her reusable book bag and the children rushed toward the front door, I was already standing there with my shoes on. Nobody had to invite me. Nobody had to convince me. Our daughter smiled the moment she saw me. "Dad, you're coming." "I wouldn't miss it," I answered. Even saying those 4 simple words made me feel surprisingly proud. The library slowly became part of our family's weekly rhythm. Instead of seeing it as a place filled with pressure, I began seeing it as one of the calmest places in our busy lives. Every visit followed a comforting pattern. The children hurried toward the colorful shelves in the children's section. Emily disappeared into the novels she loved. I walked slowly through the easy English collection, choosing books that felt interesting instead of intimidating. That single decision changed everything. For years, I had believed I needed difficult books to improve faster. Instead, I discovered that understandable books helped me improve much more. Language researchers often describe this as comprehensible input. The idea is surprisingly simple. Your brain learns best when it understands almost everything while still discovering a few new words naturally. Reading something that is slightly challenging keeps curiosity alive without creating frustration. Looking back, I realized I had spent years trying to climb the staircase 3 steps at a time instead of simply taking one comfortable step after another. Soon I created a routine that never felt like studying. Every morning before work, I read 5 pages while drinking coffee. During lunch breaks, I listened to the audiobook version of the same chapter through my headphones. In the evening, I read those pages again aloud at home. At first, I worried that repeating the same material would become boring. The opposite happened. Every repetition made my pronunciation smoother. Every familiar sentence sounded more natural. Every new word became easier to remember because I had met it several times in different ways. Scientists studying memory often explain that spaced repetition strengthens long-term recall. Instead of forcing information into your brain all at once, repeated exposure allows neural connections to grow stronger over time. I smiled when I learned that idea because I had already been doing exactly that without realizing it. Then another unexpected habit appeared. Instead of watching television every evening, our family started reading together for 20 minutes before bedtime. Nobody announced it as a new family rule. It simply happened. Emily read her novels. Our daughter curled up on the couch with adventure stories. Our son proudly explored books about space, sharks, and dinosaurs. I read my English books slowly, occasionally stopping to underline a useful phrase. The room became wonderfully quiet. Sometimes only the sound of turning pages filled the air. Those evenings became some of my favorite family memories. One Wednesday, I noticed the sign for the English Conversation Club again. This time I didn't walk past it. I signed up. To my surprise, people from all over the world attended. A retired engineer from Brazil, a nurse from South Korea, a young university student from Colombia, a father from Egypt, a grandmother from Ukraine. Some had lived in America for only a few months. Others had been there for years. Everyone spoke English differently. Everyone made mistakes. Nobody cared. The volunteer leading the group smiled before we even began. "We're not here to speak perfect English," she said. "We're here to communicate." Those 6 words quietly erased years of unnecessary pressure. Week after week, conversations became easier. Sometimes we discussed favorite foods. Sometimes we talked about American holidays. Other evenings we shared funny misunderstandings caused by language differences. One man admitted he had accidentally asked for soap instead of soup in a restaurant. The entire group laughed together. Not at him. With him. I shared my famous story about complimenting Emily's mother's tired chicken. The room exploded with laughter. For the first time, I realized that language mistakes often create friendships instead of embarrassment. Little changes began appearing outside the library too. Ordering coffee became effortless. Talking with neighbors felt natural. Parent-teacher meetings no longer filled me with anxiety. One afternoon, a new family moved into our neighborhood. They had recently arrived in America and spoke hesitant English. While everyone welcomed them politely, I noticed the nervous look in the father's eyes. I recognized it immediately. It was the same look I had carried for years. Without thinking, I smiled and said, "If you're looking for a great place to start feeling at home, visit the local library." He looked surprised. "Is it good?" I laughed softly. It changed my life. Only after saying those words did I realize how true they were. Months earlier, I had believed a library was simply a building. Now I understood it was something much greater. It was a doorway. A place where confidence quietly grows, one conversation, one book, and one ordinary visit at a time. And yet, the greatest lesson the library would teach me had nothing to do with English at all. It was about discovering what it truly means to belong to a community. Lessons beyond English. It surprised me how quickly a place that once felt intimidating became one of the places where I felt most at peace. A few months earlier, I had been afraid to walk through the library doors. Now, I recognized the familiar sound of the automatic entrance opening, the quiet laughter from the children's corner, and the gentle greetings from the librarians who somehow remembered my name. I had originally walked into the library hoping to improve my English. Instead, I walked out carrying something much bigger every single week. I carried a stronger sense of belonging. And strangely enough, that invisible gift turned out to be far more valuable than any book I ever borrowed. One Saturday morning, while Emily and the children explored their favorite shelves, I wandered into a community room where several tables had been arranged in a circle. A handwritten sign read, "Neighbor's Coffee Morning. Everyone welcome." Normally, the old version of me would have smiled politely and continued walking. This time, curiosity quietly defeated fear. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down. Within minutes, I found myself surrounded by people whose lives looked completely different from mine. A retired school teacher shared stories about traveling across the United States after retirement. A young mother talked about balancing work while raising twins. A veteran proudly described volunteering at local food banks. A college student explained how the library had become her second home during exam season. Nobody asked where I came from first. Nobody judged my accent. Instead, they asked questions that made me feel like a neighbor rather than a stranger. What books do you enjoy? Have you tried the walking trail behind the lake? Did you visit the farmer's market last weekend? Those conversations taught me something unexpected. Belonging often begins with ordinary questions, not extraordinary achievements. Researchers studying community psychology have found that regular, positive social interactions, even brief conversations with neighbors or familiar faces, can significantly improve emotional well-being and reduce feelings of isolation. Listening to those people chat so naturally, I realized that communities are not built only through grand celebrations or major events. They are built through repeated moments of simple kindness. The library seemed to understand that better than anywhere else. Every week I noticed something new. Children gathered for story time, sitting cross-legged with wide eyes as volunteers transformed simple books into magical adventures. Teenagers worked together on school projects, occasionally laughing so loudly that they quickly apologized before everyone smiled. Older adults attended free technology classes, proudly learning how to use smartphones, email, and video calls to stay connected with distant grandchildren. New immigrants practiced English together without worrying about perfect grammar. The library quietly welcomed everyone, not because everyone was the same, but because everyone was learning something. That idea stayed with me. One afternoon while returning a novel, I noticed a bulletin board covered with handwritten thank you notes. One message read, "This library helped me pass my citizenship test." Another simply said, "Thank you for making my daughter love reading." One note caught my attention more than the others. "I found my confidence here." Only 5 words, yet they felt strangely familiar. If someone had asked me where I found mine, I probably would have written the same sentence. A few weeks later, our family volunteered during the library's annual community reading festival. Emily helped organize children's activities. The kids proudly handed out bookmarks and stickers. I was asked to greet visitors at the entrance and answer simple questions. Months earlier, that assignment would have terrified me. Now it simply felt normal. At one point, a man approached carrying a map of the building. He smiled awkwardly. "I'm sorry," he said slowly. "My English, not very good." I couldn't help smiling. Those words sounded exactly like something I might have said years earlier. I answered gently, "Don't worry. You're doing great. What are you looking for?" Relief immediately appeared on his face. Together we found the language learning section. Before leaving, he thanked me several times. I watched him walk away, and something unexpected happened. For years, I had been searching for people willing to help me. Without realizing it, I had quietly become one of those people. That realization stayed with me long after the festival ended. Sometimes growth is invisible while it is happening. You only notice it when someone else stands where you once stood. At home, our evenings continued to revolve around books, conversations, and laughter. The children now teased me whenever I checked out more books than anyone else. "Dad," my son joked one evening, "you used to avoid the library." Emily laughed. "Now we have to remind him it's closing time." She wasn't wrong. The library had become part of my identity. Not because I suddenly became an expert reader. Not because my English became perfect. But because I finally understood something America had been quietly trying to teach me since the day I arrived. Learning never has an expiration date. Communities become stronger when people keep showing up. Kindness is often spoken in the simplest words. And belonging rarely arrives all at once. It grows slowly, one conversation, one smile, one borrowed book, and one brave decision at a time. As I slipped another borrowed novel into my bag that evening, I looked once more at the small plastic library card that had started this entire journey. 10 years ago, I believed it represented access to books. Now I knew the truth. It had opened the door to something much greater. It had introduced me to a community that never asked me to become someone else. It simply invited me to become more fully myself. And as beautiful as that realization was, one final lesson still waited just around the corner. A lesson that would forever change the way I measured success, courage, and even happiness itself. Every small step matters. If someone asked me today to describe the most important lesson I learned after living in the United States for more than 10 years, I would not talk about perfect grammar, a better job, or even the day I received my library card. Those things matter, of course, but they are not the real story. The real story is much quieter. It is about discovering that the life you dream about rarely begins with one giant leap. It begins with one small step that almost feels too ordinary to matter. Looking back now, I realize that my library card was never the destination. It was simply the first visible sign that I had finally stopped letting fear decide what kind of life I could live. If you have stayed with me until this moment, perhaps you are carrying your own invisible fear today. Maybe it is English. Maybe it is starting over. Maybe it is believing that you belong. Wherever you are in your journey, I hope my story reminds you that your next small step may be much more powerful than you imagine. A few months after getting my library card, I noticed something that made me stop in the middle of the library entrance. Without thinking, I walked through the automatic doors. No hesitation. No excuses. No racing heartbeat. I simply walked inside. Then I smiled. Not because anything special had happened, because nothing special had happened. The place that once terrified me had quietly become familiar. Psychologists often explain that repeated positive experiences gradually retrain the brain. What once triggered anxiety slowly becomes associated with safety instead. The fear doesn't disappear because someone gives a motivational speech. It fades because reality gently proves your worries wrong again and again. Standing there with a book in my hand, I realized I had unknowingly rewritten one of the oldest stories my mind had been telling me. I don't belong here. That sentence had finally been replaced with another. This feels like home. Those 5 words changed everything. One afternoon, while checking out a novel, the same librarian who had given me my first library card recognized me immediately. "You're becoming one of our regular visitors," she said with a warm smile. I laughed. "I think you're right." Then she looked at the stack of books in my hands and asked, "Do you remember how nervous you were the first day?" I smiled even wider. "I remember every second." She nodded. "You know, we see that a lot." Her answer surprised me. "Really?" "Oh yes," she replied. "Many people think they're the only ones who feel afraid to walk through these doors. They never are." That conversation stayed with me all day. How many fears in life convince us that we are completely alone? How many people quietly struggle with exactly the same doubts without ever talking about them? Sometimes courage begins the moment we realize we are not the only one. Our family traditions also continued to grow. Saturday mornings still belonged to the library. The children became teenagers who explored larger novels and research school projects. Emily still searched for new authors and recipes. I still wandered toward the English shelves, although now I often borrowed history books, biographies, and stories about American culture as well. English had slowly stopped feeling like a subject. It had become the language through which I experienced life. One evening, our daughter asked if I remembered the question she had asked years earlier. "Why don't you have a library card?" We all laughed. "I remember," I answered. She smiled proudly. "I think that was one of the best questions I've ever asked." She was right. Sometimes children ask questions that quietly redirect an adult's entire future. As I looked around the dinner table that evening, I realized something else had changed. Years earlier, I measured success by milestones that everyone could see. A better salary, a nicer home, a new car. Now my definition looked completely different. Success meant joining conversations instead of avoiding them. Success meant helping another newcomer feel welcome. Success meant reading bedtime stories without worrying about every pronunciation mistake. Success meant raising children who understood that learning never truly ends. Researchers studying happiness often suggest that long-term fulfillment comes less from collecting possessions and more from meaningful relationships, continuous learning, and contributing to a community. Looking back over my own journey, I could not agree more. A simple library had quietly brought all three into my life. So if you are learning English today, let me leave you with something I wish someone had told me on my very first day in America. Do not wait until you feel ready. Do not wait until your grammar is perfect. Do not wait until your accent disappears. Speak anyway. Read anyway. Ask questions anyway. Walk through the door anyway. Because confidence is not the ticket that allows you to begin. Confidence is the souvenir you collect after you begin. Perhaps your own library card is not a library at all. Perhaps it is making your first phone call in English. Perhaps it is introducing yourself to a new neighbor. Perhaps it is reading one page before bed each night. Perhaps it is leaving your first comment under this video. Whatever it is, do not underestimate it. Small actions repeated with patience create extraordinary lives. When I look at my old library card today, I no longer see a piece of plastic. I see 10 years of fear, 1 moment of courage, thousands of pages read, hundreds of conversations shared, countless family memories, and a reminder that home is not simply the place where you live. Home is the place where you finally allow yourself to grow. Thank you for spending this time with me, and for letting me share one of the most meaningful chapters of my life. If this story encouraged you, I hope you will continue practicing English a little every day. Progress is often invisible until one ordinary morning you realize that the person you once hoped to become has quietly become the person you are today. That's all for today. I'll make many more videos like this in the future. Please subscribe so you won't miss them.